Nerdarchy for Nerds by Nerds. I am Nerd Doug, and tonight I am going to blossom into a wonderful live chat with this nerd. I just made that up on the spot.
Nerdarchy Ted, how are you doing this fine and lovely evening, sir?
I'll say great because it's Monday and it's off to a great start of Nerdarchy stuff.
Cool. I would have said, that me and this nerd are going to plant some ideas.
Yes. It's been a tangled day, so.
Sure, occasionally life just wraps you all up in vine.
Yeah,
what you can do about it.
Yeah, but you suggested this topic, which was great. It's Plants Revisited because we had I don't remember if it was straight up plants. I think it was, or something
it was plants. I know,
but it was a long time ago, and it's a great topic. So I'm always
the website post that goes along with it was done on February 16th, 2020. So it was 2.5+ years ago.
Yeah,
we talked about it, and there's always new things to kind of come up and talk about. So I tossed it out there because of a couple things that wound up transpiring. But the initial idea was, the I Am Groot little, minute shorts or whatever you want to call it that went up on Disney Plus. I'm like, Groot's a fun character. Obviously, I wouldn't want to sick a I Am Groot on any gaming table. That would get rather irritating for everyone.
You mean like a character that just says that?
Yeah. But a plant-based race would be kind of cool. And I'm like, well, I could do that off air, or we could discuss it and kind of come up with some ideas and do it live.
Yeah, that is great. And you mentioned plant-based race. I am surprised there isn't one. I think there has been in previous editions. Wasn't there, like, were they little thorny looking people or something, I want to say?
I'm not sure. It makes sense, but with all of the editions and books that came out, especially with third, there were lots of options back then. So
yeah, I want to say I can picture it in my mind. I know it was in fourth edition, but it was probably something from an earlier edition as well. They were like little green, spiky, leafy looking creatures, as I recall. But I think a plant race, one thing that's interesting about different like playable races, like even beyond other like mammalian things, and like your experience playing a lizard folk too, it's like some things are just so different that it's like they almost demand you have some kind of different perspective for the character, right? Like a plant-based character, it's like, yeah, sure, maybe maybe photosynthesis isn't a part of it, but at least it'd be something that you could play on, or like the fact that like you get sustenance from the sun or whatever, like just plant-like qualities. Maybe you're more active in the day or something, and you're like at night you're closed up. In fact, there Guild Wars 2, you ever hear of that game?
Yeah.
They're one of the playable races is like a plant-based thing, and it's pretty cool. Like in the game when it's night, it's like you're in the inside veins glow like a different color because it's like they're luminescent and things like that. I think there's a lot to play with there.
That would be a lot of fun to kind of work with. So I didn't put together any concepts beyond I didn't even have a name, but I'm like If I were to make a plant-based race, I'd want to go in 3 different directions.
Okay.
So I look at, kind of Trent-like, so it would have more barky kind of skin. I'd want to go something viney, so like maybe this could be your correlation of things with thorns.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they can protrude the thorns, but they don't always have them. And then I wanted to do something floral, so that like almost have this big mantle, and whether they fluff out their petals or whether they have them draped down like a gown kind of thing could be an interesting aspect to the character or to the race. And the way WotC is doing things now, like you don't need to have the race be the same height, so like you could totally just be like, all right, choose small or medium for any of them. No big deal. You don't have to worry about assigning stats because you just say, hey, either pick 2+, or pick a +2 and a +1, pick 3+1s, and you're good.
So, I'm glad. I'm really glad you brought that up because it's with the one D&D playtest going on, and we already had the first one with the races and backgrounds. I, as a designer, like a professional game
Sure.
designer, I think that I am excited about those changes because there's just new stuff to create too, and new approaches to creating. Like, it's been kind of weird because, like, well, as a gamer and somewhat of a traditionalist, it's just like, I don't like this. Like, you got feats with your backgrounds and blah blah blah. But as a designer, it's super exciting because it's like, well, that just opens up huge amounts of space. Excuse me. And even with the races, like, I don't think it was specifically like called out in that document, but it seems like they're doing sub races a little different, where it's like, like the Ardling, or even the more classic ones like Elf and Gnome. I don't think they call them sub races. It's just like, well, as part of being an elf, pick one of these lineages. And I think that would fit perfect with what you're saying, because it feels more like it's not like a distinct, I guess that's the difference. If it doesn't feel so much like a distinct sub race as like, well, how does your plantness manifest, or your elfness, or whatever. And so it's like, do you embody more of the aspect of like the blooming flower, like you said, or the thorny vine, or the
toughened exterior?
Right. So I think those are three really great sort of tent poles upon, like, under which to think of like a plant type race.
But one of the aspects of the Groot, if you will, and I'm sorry if you're behind the times on Guardians of the Galaxy. I'm about to deliver a spoiler, but let's face it, if you haven't watched the original Guardians of the Galaxy in the MCU, you probably aren't going to care about what I'm going to say. But Groot dies, and Rocket takes a twig and grows a new Groot, and that's considered his son and what have you. But I thought, like, even though WotC is moving away from like cultural things and sticking at biological, what if like that's exactly how this kind of race produces? Like, maybe you don't have to die to cut off a section of yourself and grow a child, but even if you do die and somebody has that knowledge, they could continue your line, if you will.
Yeah, I think we could, this is one case, right? At least one case where I feel like the magical connectionalism, for lack of a better term, would actually fit quite well, because plants, it's like, of course we're talking about like a sapient thing that is plant-like, but the analogies are there, and it's like, well, I mean, roots and things, they are connected. So it's like, maybe that's part of the lore for this thing, or is it like, well, and actually you can kind of borrow from that Guild Wars too also, because those plant people, I forget what they're called, but they deal a lot with like a dreaming type of world. It's like, before you grow in the real world, it's like you sort of form in this other place, like this plant dream basically, and then you have to like travel through like a vine to get to the real world. It's basically the tutorial, but the lore is there, and I think that could be really cool for what you're saying. It's just like, well, there's a part of you that's always connected to this system of your people, right? And maybe it's in a mystical way. It's like, your roots aren't physically connected, but they reach out somewhere into the ether, into another plane or whatever. And I think that could be really cool, like you said, whether it's, maybe that's how they, their culture propagates. It's like they take little cuttings, and, maybe you have to beat a certain point, or there, something must happen. And then you're talking like, adventure hooks baked in of like, you need to protect this little thing because it's important, or, maybe find like certain soil that it missed, or whatever. I mean, there's tons of adventure hooks that you go with as well for the DM.
And like I said, whether you approach it as it was a PC or just some NPC that you're trying to cultivate and like, it still could be something that's rather cool. And while culture is not a thing anymore, it still would be kind of neat to have this aspect. And like, I know that not a lot of people are into the oh, well, let's do the escort quest or whatnot, but to bring back, the child of some, long dead hero would be like, oh, well, what does this mean for the race or for the populace?
Oh, then that just made me think like a Path of the Zealot plant person would be kind of neat. Like thematically, like just to reflavor that, like, that zealot rage is just like, that's just the planty nature. It's like they can't
Sure.
really die. While we were talking, I looked up real quick. I've mentioned it many times. Is that hyperlanes thing, because it has like the species sort of builder, and one of them is Plantoid. And I thought that was worth mentioning. One of the traits, potential traits, is Barky covering, like to your point, which just gives you a base AC. Extra limbs is something that could be interesting for, like, more viney things. And then it actually has a photosynthesis trait. I don't know if I do it like this, but at least it's a place to start. It says, so long as you have access to direct sunlight during a rest period, you can roll an extra hit die whenever you recover hit points from rest. That's pretty cool. I mean, I don't know how much often that would come into use, but it's a decent way to represent that, right? That you're like, oh, I have the sun. It's like a little extra healing. I think that's cool.
So I have to, throw out a massive apology. I forgot to pull up the winners for
oh yeah, it's the first.
It is the first Monday of the month, and I didn't think about it until just now. So I will get information for that to Doug and Dave, who'll be doing it next week when I am in England.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Traveling
That's
to
going to be
in a
exciting.
castle. And there
Very exciting.
Some fun and interesting plants in that particular adventure. Who only time will tell, because who knows? Maybe some of my players are watching.
Yes. Yeah, well, I know you've been working on that for a long time and refining it. It's sort of like a take on your kind of go-to adventure, which is a great idea. So I'm jealous of your players. I think they're going to have a fantastic time playing that campaign.
Well, I've got some fun things that I've was rooting into today. Another idea, popped out and blossomed, and was kind of went for a 3-mile walk with my son to kind of bounce some ideas off of him. It's a good sounding board.
Mm-hmm.
Never DM'd before, but he always likes hearing the stories and the ideas, and
cool.
One of those things that it's fun to share.
Yeah. Let's see.
When I look back into the annals of history, as I said, back in 2020, we did the thing about plants.
Mm-hmm.
Go into that. I made a carnivorous flower. If somebody wants to go check that out, it's a nice little challenge 5 that somebody can go play around with if you need an extra plant to attack your players with.
I don't remember what I mentioned.
You talked about some lore and some spells.
Oh, okay.
So I mean, we're only 15 minutes into it, but there's plenty of things that come to my mind when I think about plants. Not only do they represent a nice hazard or obstacle, but I know in a somewhat recent session of my kids' game, which we started a new game recently, so we're only like 2 or 3 sessions in, but plants make excellent fetch quests items. When you look at a wizard's,
oh yeah, for sure.
There's so many things that are like, oh, well, you need this thing and you need that thing. Well, if they somehow lose their focus or lose their spell component pouch, you can just be like, all right, well, you need to go find these things and possibly build your component pouch. But then when you get into herbalism and alchemy, like there's a lot of plants that are used in that too.
Mm-hmm.
So you can go and find those kind of rare reagents.
Yeah, it's funny. You had mentioned earlier, like escort quests people don't normally like, or fetch quests and things like that. And it's like, as we're talking about, I'm thinking like, really, if you boil any adventure down, it's like there really isn't that many types.
Sure.
And like those are so common to things, and it's like it's the details of those that make them
Right.
exciting. Now, personally, like when it comes to escort quests, I tend to not like them in video games because because it's like, well, it's designed to like everything out there is going to beeline for the thing you're trying to protect. Where I mean, like it's just programmed like that, right?
Right.
It's like in a D&D game, I don't think it would necessarily quite be like that.
Unless you're talking about assassins and they're their target.
Sure.
But not most escort quests are not like that. It's like, oh, take this guy through this field. All right, well, is every hunting cat bypassing you to kill that thing? Or you kidding?
Right, right. Although, something like a plant, I mean, you could certainly introduce those elements, like maybe it's letting off a pheromone that attracts predators of it, and that is why it needs an escort, which again, I think would be fun. I mean, all those little things, it's like that's what makes for fun, challenging scenarios for your adventures to deal with.
And I don't mean to stereotype, but let's face it, we have a very male dominated hobby, and well, what happens if one particular creature that's out there for some reason is biologically programmed to target females, and if you've got an all male party, well, the female could be the target of said hunting creature,
putting out those pheromones.
That's just some ideas, and like like the stereotype and what have you. But like heck, even in my kids' party, I've got a party of 6. There's one female player, and they're playing a guy.
In my in that Spelljammer campaign I ran for many years, one of the antagonists, they often like ongoing antagonists, were the Themigo. Are you familiar with them at all? It's it's a Lovecraft thing, and they had I think Toma Beasts had a take on them back in the day. And they're basically like fungoid insect things from outer space. And so there was a lot of like plant related things that the players dealt with them. I remember one of their adventures, and this was kind of like a example of how that campaign ran too, because it's like they would just hear lots of rumors and things over time, and then obviously don't have time to follow up on all of them, so I would have to I didn't keep strict time, but it was like months and months and months went by. Oh, what about that thing? And then they go and check it out. It's like it's probably not going to be the same situation as when they heard about it. So there was like some missing researchers or something like that. I don't remember exactly what they were. That somebody had wanted looked into, and so they eventually did that, and they were taken by the Themigo, who were experimenting on them and trying to make them basically into pod people. And it was like right after what is it, Volos, whichever one had the Vegapygmies in it. I just wanted to use them. So it was like they'd put people in pods that were transforming them into Vegapygmies. So the players were really grossed out by that, because they were like the pods open, and it was like there's the sap or fluid or whatever. And I just described, and like some of them were like not all the way there, so they were just half plant people and things, and they were really horrified. And I wasn't trying to make it really, you know what I mean? I was just, but it's like just must have been so evocative for them. I just remember them being so repulsed by the whole thing.
Even you're describing something that happened years ago, but I mean you're still doing a great description that could be like, all right, well, this is where on this borderline, where in the sliding scale is that? That could be pretty messing with your head if
and like their goal was to basically just make like pod people. I just took it literally, where it's like they just grew them in a pod and they were plant people, and they were like replacing other people, like key people, with these plant people was their plan. And I just remember there's such a really visceral reaction from the players. I was like, I gotta take note of that. They did not like that.
Well, I mean, sometimes that's cool, like unless it's actually like triggering something, like getting a reaction out of somebody is something that I like doing. I like to make sure that things are getting a reaction,
Yeah.
that you're describing well enough to be like, all right, wow, they're really into it. They've bought into what's going on here.
I think that was one of my favorite aspects of that whole campaign overall, because it's like it was so big and so expansive, and we played so long that it's like things like those Migo had like chance to breathe. It's like they didn't run into them all the time, but like so it was like just creepy enough where if they came up, they're like, oh man, like what are those guys doing now? And having like a little connection to what the last time they had encountered them was fun. So like kind of seeding those ideas through multiple things.
Now, you mentioned replacing, and that's something that I feel is something that we talk about often, but you could easily replace the description of a monster that already exists and just reskin it to make it be something that's already, that's mechanically already there, and you just want to drop something into the game that the players might not be aware of. And
there's even precedent for that, and it's not even reskinned. It's all those Spore Servants. I don't know if you've ever come across those, and you're looking around D&D Beyond, which are all from Out of the Abyss, that are just creatures that were infected by Zuggit spores. So it's like they don't have any plant-like abilities or anything. They're like, I'm looking right now, Drow Spore Servant. It's like, just got a short sword. It is immune to a few conditions and things like that because it's planty nature. But yeah, just even a little tweak like that, you're saying, it's like, just give them one little trait, like they said, they're immune to like blind, charm, frightened, and paralyzed, which is probably just like a planty thing. Otherwise, it's just the same stat block and the way you describe it.
I had I was having a bad day, and I don't know whether I forgot that I was running that evening or what. But I'm like, all right, they need to fight something. Crap, what are they gonna fight? And my brain just was not on point. And they're walking through, this dense jungly forest kind of thing, and they wind up seeing this like massive vine structure, central trunk, in the center, and then it's like sprouting off of that, and it's like almost like you'd see in a vegetable garden where it's like all attaching into the ground, and these large size, like radish skinned humanoids kind of like pulled themselves up out of the ground and went, all ferocious on the players. Nobody asked for a lore check. I didn't really put too much thought into it, but I looked through and I'm like, all right, I want something this, and something that's this challenge rating and something that's that challenge rating. And I realized, well, Troll's a 5, and a Troll Abomination or whatever it was that had like the multiple heads and multiple arms.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, that fits, and it's the same base creature. This will be great. Oh, it regenerates. So maybe, the blood loss of the other things is what turns these plant-based things that reddish color. So yeah, that's what these things are all about. Done and done. Let's go to town. And I had this huge fight against, high level parties using this slightly modified, just visuals on these creatures. And
sure,
now it was a hard fight. I actually killed one of the players because Troll Abominations are no joke. But it dropped the fighter, and then it still had extra attack. So it's like, all right, swipe, and dead was dead. Now I knew that the cleric had the ability to revivify, so I knew like it was only going to be a minor hurdle because there's nothing in D&D that hurts you for being dead for too long. So
yeah, there's woefully not a lot of plant creatures in 5e. And it's funny, I'm looking at my D&D Beyond, and it's just like even the mounts there is less because like a lot of them are just like the legacy ones that were. But that being said, there are some standouts, and some of my favorite, including one of my favorite monsters, the Woad, which just looks really cool and has an awesome story that kind of speaks to what we were talking about originally. Do you know like the Woad?
I don't.
So a Woad is made when somebody volunteers to become a protector of like a woodland, right? And the druids of the area, remove the person's heart while they're alive. It's basically the like in Game of Thrones, the children of the
Okay.
what are they called? Children of the Seed or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyways, they remove the person's heart, bury it, and then the tree that grows out of that becomes a wood woad. I always thought that was just kind of a cool story. I'm sure it was probably a folklore, connection.
Right. I mean, it's really a cool story. I'm now a little leery of certain plants. I pay attention to any time that something wonky happens at my own table. So I definitely am cautious when I use animated armors, and I'm now cautious when I use assassin vines. So maybe it's monsters that start with A that I should be worried about. But I put an assassin vine against the kids' party, and man, they made some poor choices, had some bad dice rolls, and like I was really afraid that I was about to kill two of them. It was a near thing.
Oh yeah, I remember you telling me about that. Yeah. Like you're like, whoa, these things are really dangerous.
Yes. So
I guess, and part of just the whole thing with plants in general, it's like there's it doesn't sound very menacing. And, even like that assassin vine, it's just like, well, until it does anything, it just looks like a vine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like there's really no way to detect those things and stuff.
Sure.
Unless I mean, I'm imagining they probably have like that false appearance. Yeah. When it's motionless, it's indistinguishable from a normal plant.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think can be a lot of fun when it comes to plant life is that they are in that place where it's like, well, you don't know there's a monster here until you're right up on it.
Yeah, even the classic shambling mound just looks like a big pile of decaying vegetable matter before it does anything, right?
So, I mean, it could be decaying, or it could just be like, it looks like a massive, dense shrub.
Right.
So, that's one of the, things that makes it awesome.
Yeah. When you had mentioned earlier about plants for like wizard components and stuff like that, it reminded me of recently, I've been on a huge zombie survival kick since I started rewatching Walking Dead to catch up because I hadn't watched the new episodes, and then I found this zombie game and everything, a video game called State of Decay that's really cool. So I had written a blog post about it and like how to, just some thoughts on like simulating that, even in D&D where zombies aren't really all that dangerous. And the chat might be interested too. I incorporated some ideas from chat. I think it was when you and I did a chat before, we were talking about like the zombie swarm and how it can stab you and stuff. So I actually statted that up in the post. But one of the things that I like about the zombie survival genre is like, making sure like it's more about like the community survival than any individual. And like one of those things is food, right? And of course, there's things like create food and water and blah blah blah. But like one of the DM tips I shared in that was, that's all well and good, but you can also just make your quests about those things. Like, it's like, we need food basically, or medicine, right? It's like I identified it as like food, medicine, defenses, and basically, what was the fourth one? Fuel, however that translates, whether it's fantasy or whatever, to keep your community going, right? And so, like, well, you could easily just use like medicinal herbs, right, as your, the medicine thing. And so it's like, look, we have got like people are dying, right? We don't have enough medicine to keep this community going, so we need you to go out like and scavenge basically or whatever. You could certainly use plants for that. I mean, it's medicinal plants or mystical herbs have been part of fantasy stories and role-playing games as long as I can remember. And like in something like that or a quest, it's kind of easy for a DM because it's like, well, it's not really like a magic item or like a mechanical thing that you have to like stat out like, what does it do if you eat this herb? But you could, but it's also just a plot device, right? It's just like, you need this thing, it's out there, your adventure is to go find it and bring it back.
Right. And like, as we've kind of brought up is, plants make excellent hazards and what have you.
Oh yeah.
Um, Rob's cleaning service, talked about using something like stinging nettles, and having them in my own yard is definitely something that we've experienced. Like, I'm thankful that we did the work in my yard over the summer and not during the school year, because my son was, before we got the goats, and that's a whole nother story. Like, we were working in the back part of the yard, and it looked like somebody had kind of like smacked him a handful of times because the nettles were so striped on his back that it was like, holy crap, man, that looks really bad and really bad.
Yeah. Yeah, plants, I think that's a big part of the exploration pillar. We had mentioned, like, like we said, the stinging nettles, or, things that like feel like they'd be more like a combat complication. But I think that can just as easily make your exploration segments really amazing too, because not only, I mean, could plants like the plant growth spell just create difficult terrain, which is, I guess that's probably not as impactful if you do a lot of theater of the mind.
Right.
Although I use things like that, and I just kind of like, even you can still just sort of like err on the side of the players just a little less if that's going on. But yeah, just things like that. I think there's so many little fiddly bits that, and that's a frequent question all creators get, including us. Like, how do I make my combats more interesting, or anything really? And it's like, just use what's there. I mean, not only the mechanical things, like I said, making it difficult terrain or the grasping vines. It's also a fantasy world, and I mean, you've played with me a lot. I very much am into the fact that it's like, I don't have to be constrained by what the real world looks like. So it's like, huge trees, huge plants that are different colors that just wouldn't be that color in our world, because it's like they're green because of photosynthesis. So it's like maybe they're getting, nutrients from like planar emanations, and these ones are blue or whatever, it doesn't matter. Right. So, I mean, it's an aspect that I think if you consider when you're a DM, you could find a fertile ground in which to grow lots of different ideas to entice your players. And as you know, it's like, as a DM, players, just everything you say carries importance for the players. So I feel like that's almost kind of like a DM trick, or is that like just describing something in an interesting way can do a lot of heavy lifting of engaging the players, because it's like they might pique their curiosity, and next thing you know, they're doing nature checks to examine these plants and all that stuff, and then that buys you some time to think like, well, I was just describing them weird, but they seem really interested, so what should I do with this now?
Right. Well, so like, I look at that, and your idea, planted some ideas in my own head. Like, okay, something's a different color. Well, what is the reason why something could be a different color? Is it naturally this new color? Has it been modified by something, or what have you? So, well, perhaps there's something buried down there, and maybe that's the clue. Dig it up, and they'll find some kind of treasure, and it's giving off some kind of aura that has affected these particular plants. Well, maybe these plants are something special that the Fae like, and they use special Fae magic to warp the colors of plants, because having everything be green is just too boring, and Fae are anything but. So like, you could go down that kind of road, or maybe it's something that it's another mystery to find out, and you don't know, they don't know, but you'll figure it out between the next sessions. It's like, you could play with it from that angle, pretty darn easily.
Yeah, that just made me think of another classic thing that sort of fantasy trope that I often incorporate in games, is that elves, or whatever gnomes, whichever race or species or culture in your world you want to apply this to, but like, people growing their homes and things out of the plants, right? Like I can't imagine well, I'll just use traditional elves as the example, but you know, stand in for whatever. It's like I don't really picture them like sawing lumber, you know, nailing boards together to build a house. I would have imagined more that like cultivating their homes from the plant life
Right.
around them, and that can work in any environment, really. I mean, we're talking about plants, but as I was thinking, I'm thinking like under the sea would be a really cool day, just growing, I mean, like out of coral or plant life. But I even took that so far as like in my Spelljammer game, and I don't remember if this was part of the original Spelljammer lore. I made it up, but like I like the idea is the elves like grew their ships too because they have like a lot of plant look to them, and the wings always looked kind of membranous to me, and I always just imagined like, well, they're probably just growing those things too.
Yeah, it would make sense to me.
Yeah. Same way, you know, hey, dwarves carve rock, elves, you know, sing to the plants or whatever, or like I said, gnomes or humans, whoever, you know, or it could just be everybody that lives in this region. That's how they do it. You know, it doesn't have to be the same race, but
right. Yeah, so definitely a lot of different directions that you
sure
could kind of take that aspect, and you know, maybe that's a whole nother branch of magic. You know, that you know, is that druidic, or is that like, you know, some other kind of wizardry? Like there's definitely ways to kind of tweak and twist things.
Yeah, you know, and there's so many ways in D&D even now existing that deal with plants in unusual ways that aren't really developed mechanically. They leave a lot of space. Like I'm thinking like speak with plants, speech of beast and leaf. I mean, there's not really a whole lot of guidance of like what would you know, what would a fern have to say or whatever, right? And especially with like the speech of beast and leaf, I always think it's weird because you don't understand the things that you're talking to. So it kind of like, I mean, maybe you can help me with this. So, like I get that, you know, if you're speaking to an animal and it, you know, makes a sound, you don't understand what it means, but you could still observe that it like maybe it understands me if you said
Right.
like, oh, go fetch that, it brings it back. But like with the plant thing, I always wondered like, what is the point of that? Like I think it's a cool ability, but it's like,
Right.
you know, if you speak to a plant, it's not going to react at all. It's like that, even if it understands you, it's not like it's going to move. It can't move of its own volition, basically. So it's like, what's the point of that?
Well, I'm certain, like, you know, if you're talking to a monstrous plant, you know, it could be like, don't attack us. Or like, you know, if you're talking to something that poison oak, poison ivy, you know, like, oh, could you pull your, you know, whatever it excretes, you know, could you pull that inside as I walk by? Like, there's always ways to
Yeah.
figure out how that's going to, you know.
And you do get advantage on your charisma checks to influence them. So,
So like, you know, you could ask, and well, maybe they've got, you know, the ability to kind of twist and point a direction.
sure.
You know, like, oh, can you tell us which way to go? And it just you know, back in the direction you came, or you know, one side or the other, you know, whatever.
Yeah, things like that. I would encourage DMs, you know, to just err on the side of like just leaning into the fantasy of it. Like, yes, poison oak it cannot move, like even if it can't like move like that, right? You know, it's not just gonna like curl up and stuff. But we're talking a fantasy game too, so it totally could. I think those are neat, and I would like players to use abilities like that more. So I would totally lean into that.
Of course, you know, like if we're going to talk about, you know, talking plants, I mean, we can certainly not forget about Henry Crabgrass.
Oh, yes, yes. Make sure you always get consent.
Because I'm certain that, you know, when that session started, Matt was not going to be thinking about, you know, having to role play as a section of crabgrass near Molly's grave.
That's the thing about being DM, boy. You know, you just never know what you're gonna have to do that night, right? Which, you know, it's kind of like I think it was Dave and I were talking a couple weeks ago. Like that's kind of at this point part of the fun and excitement of being a DM for me is like I don't want to know what's like. I like, right? It's like I like having some things in my pocket, but it's like that's the thrill of sitting down, and that's probably where some of the anxiety for a lot of DMs comes from is the not knowing. But it's like I kind of just dealt with that so long. It's like, well, that's just part of the game. I actually kind of like that now. It's like I like the unexpected developments that make me think.
It's that controlled chaos of like, all right, well, I'm gonna serve, the ball over to their side, and who knows what direction it's gonna come back at me.
I actually have you to thank as a major contributing factor in like getting over that hurdle for me. It was from during our, and there wasn't anything you tried to do per se, but it was when we were playing in Just Quest, and it was like the second or third session, and I've mentioned this before, but like my main antagonist, like he had a power that was basically just, he could escape. He had the same thing as Steven. He had a key that he could just like open a portal.
Right.
And I was like, okay, when he gets to this level point, that's what he's going to do. And you're like, oh, I have a thing that I can interrupt somebody to like grab them or whatever it was. I was like, okay. And then you just succeeded and he didn't get away. And, like in the moment, I was like, oh man, what am I going to do? But I can't even imagine that campaign any other way now. It's like, you know what I mean?
Sure.
So it's like sometimes just give in and just go with it and see, that's a good general pro tip for like, you're big bad guy getting away or living another day or whatever. It's like, well, they didn't because the players had abilities or a good plan or whatever. It's like, just go with it. You never know. It might end up being way more fun than you ever anticipate. Almost certainly will be.
Yeah, when you're looking at the game, it is all of your stories, and if the players are having fun, your bad guy dying or what have you is not in any way, shape, or form important. Even if it's before their time, let them die, let them have the win, and figure out what the next session is. I know we've talked many times about the DM break and all these other things. Like,
I actually found it to be incredibly rewarding in the sense of like, well, now you've got a frenemy with you that is privy to information that you wouldn't have known.
Right.
And you sort of like, it becomes a resource, but also it's like an embedded DM thing. It's like, I can do whatever I want. It's like, maybe they work to betray the party, or maybe they, don't, like he didn't. I mean,
right.
He never was super nice to you guys, but it was. I thought it was a fun relationship where it was just like, well, yeah, he's an expert. He just wants to become a culinary magician, like Dr. Christopher. So it's like, well, they thwarted me, but now I'm just with them, and they're not, they're letting me do my research. So okay, it was just became like a really fun aspect of that campaign to me.
So, I mean, I don't want to divert away from the Spelljammer stuff. Have you got more to get into?
Oh no, yeah, I'm just rambling on, man.
I did have some other ideas.
Sure.
So when it comes to plants, number one, plants do have, as we kind of briefly mentioned, some irritants or toxins that they produce. So like they can either be a source of these kinds of things, and nobody I know enjoys getting poison ivy, and I'm fairly susceptible to it. So
I've never gotten it.
Lucky you.
I'm very timid.
Well, I enjoy being in the woods, but sometimes the woods is like, nah, I'm going to annoy you, and there's some of it even in my own yard that just won't go away. So I'm working out in the yard. It's the last day before the kids go to school, and I'm like, come on, let's get this work done. And over the weekend, I wound up catching some more. So I'm sitting there dealing with that annoyance.
Yeah.
But beyond being something that you can deal with as a hazard or gain the advantage of if there's an extraction, aspect of it, plants can be something that are involved in visions or in, prophecy and that kind of stuff. I started watching a show this weekend that a white rose was a big deal in, this particular show. And it comes up throughout multiple episodes and what have you. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit, creepy and modern, not in the fantasy, I would say check out Devil in Ohio. I really enjoyed it. It's only 8 episodes long. It's on Netflix, so check it out. Up to you.
It's got Ohio in it, so it must be good.
That was actually one of the reasons why I decided to watch the trailer.
Really?
I've got some friends out in Ohio. Let's do this.
Yeah, as something you said that reminded me too. I don't know how familiar you are with like Superman lore, but do you know what Black Mercy is by any
I
chance?
don't.
If I said, so do you remember it was basically,
Was that the one that debilitated Spider-Man or Superman in a dream?
yes, right. I was going to say it was basically a parasitic alien plant
Yeah.
that attaches to somebody and provides you like a dream of your perfect life because it's feeding off the psychic energy. Now that sounds freaking awesome for like a one shot or something.
Yeah.
For the players, or to find like a trusted NPC with that on them, because it's like, well, if you just pull it off the thing, it kills them.
Right.
So it's like do you go into that with them, or it could just be like the players, the player characters are affected by that thing.
I think the mechanics for something like that would be really helpful, Doug.
Well, yeah, certainly. That seems like a good newsletter thing to explore. Yeah, and like I'm imagining, like, well, the setup for like a one shot like that, I wouldn't role play like them receiving the thing and then attacking it. I would just like start the session with like, this sort of perfect situation that they've got. It would be especially great if there was like a tense stuff going on in the previous session. That's just like everything's totally nice and normal, and then just like see those little like weirdnesses. Like, is this real? Like, if you can get the players at any point in this session to be like, is this really happening? You won. You did it.
Yeah, I am incredibly enthralled by this idea. It's been a long time since I've watched the Justice League and the Justice League Unlimited, but they were.
Oh yeah, they totally did it on it. Yep.
So.
And what a great dramatic situation too, because it's like we're really once like for Superman in that case, it's like I don't want to leave this situation because it is nice, but I now realize this isn't real.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
and kind of emotional.
The head game that plays is just fantastic.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, with a little bit of setup, I think you could totally have an awesome one-off adventure for an ongoing parties. Because I think it would work better with an existing party because it's like you would know what their perfect situation would be.
Right. So I mean, that's definitely a good direction to go. Do you have any plants or any things that you've made for your own world, for your own games?
My not that I can recall offhand, but I rely, like, every time I run a game or even make a character, I always make a Pinterest board for them.
Okay.
And this is just sort of like a general pro tip I would suggest to any DM. There's so much amazing fantasy art out there. So I like to make like a Pinterest board of just like, well, all the things that evoke what I want to get out of this campaign, this character, whatever. And because it's visual thing, it gives you a great palette to describe to the players. So I'm sure many times I've just, added art of, just fantastical looking plant life and just describing, especially when I'm playing like online, it's like I'll just have a window. I'm literally just describing something, like a painting I'm looking at, and
describe something you've already got the artwork for.
Right. And a lot of times that's just really helpful for me. If I do it beforehand, it might give me some ideas for what that means or an adventure. But a lot of times I'm just describing it, and like I said earlier, just seeing what the players do and in reaction to those descriptions. But yeah, I don't know. Nothing comes to mind per se right off the top of my head, like a specific thing.
Well, then let me ask another question. Do you have any favorite plants from the real world, that you've brought?
I really like. It sounds silly, but I like moss and like lush ground
Okay.
growth. And I think it's a lot because when I took a trip to Germany long ago, we were hiking through the Black Forest.
You
That
like
was
bringing that up.
that was probably the closest I've ever seen in real life with my own eyes to
Hmm.
what I would imagine like a primeval, like when you're, adventurers or traveling through
Hmm.
the forest. That's what it would look like because it was just like everything was just covered in this rich, green soft moss and like just, it was just really kind of like enchanting in that way to me.
Sure.
And I think about that a lot. But I don't know. I just like that that softness of plants and like mossy things and
Sure.
vine covered things. I guess that it's a good indicator of time, passage of
Mm.
time too, which you could use, in your game, especially if you want to play with, time that has passed, maybe unnaturally so, of just like something that's familiar to the characters is now covered in lichen, vine,
Mhm.
or whatever the next time they see it.
So for those of you, watching at home that wonder why I shake my fist at Doug, as I've told him before, and may have told you guys, my number one travel destination is the Schwarzwald or the Black Forest in Germany. So it was actually
It's
brought up in
worth it.
conversation just yesterday at a family get together.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, you got the double whammy. Yeah, it was pretty awesome and just magical. And like I said, it's so like there's no cars or anything. And the people I was with were also just nerdy gamers too. So of
Mhm.
course we were just talking about that a lot. Like this is what it would be like, or at least
So
visually, right? Like looking.
one day I will get out there, but alas, it is not this day. But for me, I actually had taken a trip a number of years ago out to Hawaii, and the bird of paradise flower is so different from the structure of a regular blossoming flower, um that they're just really cool because they've got that long like beak looking thing, so
I
because
never looked it up that before. It actually looks like a bird,
yeah.
which is probably why it's called that.
Yeah, so
Huh.
I like I like using that as inspiration to be like, oh well, what other kind of things might I be able to make, either as just something visually for the characters to look at, or something to be like, oh well, this is clearly something different that you've never seen of, maybe never heard of. So like I know that there is a sword plant out there, but like, what if there are legitimately a sword plant that it has leaves that are silver and metallic, and maybe the elves cultivate that to do something
That's how they get their weapons.
for
They just
building
grow them,
for
right?
weapons. So like there's definitely ways to extrapolate and use that kind of thing, and
Which, oh, sorry.
because we're talking about magic, like you don't need to worry about like, man, that's not how it works. Well, you know what? When you want it to work, it can.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, like I was thinking as we were talking, like, well, there, like, you probably could pick spells and things that are dealing with this, and like, maybe you're a druid. Like, there's a lot of plant related stuff, but again, some people think this is like a cheesy cop out, but it's like reflavoring goes a long way if you want to be like a plant wizard type of thing, or plant mage, or even like a fighter or something. Just describe things different as just make them plant themed, right? It's like maybe your magic missiles are like thorny vines, or like an explosion of thorns or whatever,
Right.
or your sleep spell is like pollen or whatever that you like spreading over the air to make things go to sleep.
Yeah, and that's another thing that I absolutely adore, is when you've got these situations where somebody just decides they're gonna just reflavor everything that their character does. I kind of talked about it in my newsletter that went out yesterday. Was like, my son, his paladin just got to level 4 and got access to the shield spell. It's like, well, all right, so how does that look like for your warforged character? My shadow sorcerer, that we're about to start tomorrow night, season 2 of those bastards.
Woohoo!
He, manipulates the shadows that are around him, whenever he's casting any spell. Like, I don't think there's ever been a time there's like, yes, you are standing in bright light everywhere. There's not a single shadow. I'd be like, all right, fine, darkness. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so like that's just how he does his thing. But he's not all dark and creepy and Mr. Broody and what have you. That's where his magic comes from. That doesn't make him. It doesn't influence him. So it's fun.
That's something that comes up for us many times in chats, and I think about it a lot. It's like, I feel like players have as much to bring to the table as any DM, right? It's like,
Sure.
I'm expecting, a setting that I can interact with and stuff, but I want to do the interacting. Like, I take being a player very seriously, and so like things like you just said, it's like it doesn't really have any mechanical bearing, but it's like, but you're contributing to painting the picture of this fantasy story with things like that. So like I said, even if you are a druid, it's like, well, just flavor all of your spells, planty, if you want to, really, focus on that aspect of them.
There's just lots of good ways to go about doing that.
Yeah, for sure.
We're getting down to our last 5 minutes. Go ahead and any ideas you guys might or questions that you might want from us, in the chat. Do you have any other topics that you wanted to get into, Doug?
I was gonna also say, plants are also a source, and some people in chat have mentioned this a few times too, of like toxins and poisons, all those things. And a lot of players love that fantasy of like being a poisoner or an assassin or whatever. And I think that's another case where it's like, well, you can fulfill those players' fantasy by making those things part of their adventures, in the sense of like, it doesn't have to be the main quest, but like I'm thinking of games like Skyrim, for instance. Like, there's always quests and adventures, but there's just like all kinds of like plants that you can just pick out there, and different ingredients, and then like combine them in an alchemy station to make different kinds of poisons and things. So I think like incorporating some ideas like that would be awesome for those players too. Like, if you got a player that's interested in alchemy at all, or poisons or whatever, it's like, well, then, keep that in mind and reward those players by, giving opportunities for those things. Like, at least 2 of our products have like 10 new plant-based poisons inside of Treasures of the Tundra does, and can't think of the other one. But at the same token, players too, if that is your jam, then role play that. Like when you're in the dungeon or in the forest, it's like, ask those things like, well, is there any signs of like, any of these plants? You don't have to know the specific, but you could just say like, the plants that I might need to manufacture whatever that it is.
Right. Or, you could even go so far as to be like, oh, well, even if you're not trying to extract poisons and what have you from, you could be like, well, my character is interested in plants.
Yeah.
So like, are there any plants I've never seen before? Or are there any plants that I've heard of but never seen?
I would say here's a good general tip. You could start by looking at your tool proficiencies, which I always think of in this way. But you just pick something that your character's a nerd about, basically. Like that's the way I always describe tools. Like that's what you're nerdy about. If you got alchemist supplies, so it's like, then you like that stuff, right? It's like you know about like plants and poultices and things. So it's like, so when you're exploring an environment, like look at it through that lens, right? If you got carpenter's tools, like what's the woodwork in this room look like? Because that is probably what you would notice. So and same goes for skills too. It's like if you actually have like proficiency in the nature skill, it's not just like, I kind of know about plants. It's like you're a walking, travel guide, right? Basically, it's like, what I mean? Or like one of those flora and fauna books, like on 2 legs. So it's like, interact with the environment through those lens of those things. And I think you might be surprised how often that can lead to an enriched situation.
Yeah, your mechanical choices can beget role playing if you so desire, especially when you're looking at, what it is that you've got.
Yeah.
Like
and a lot of it's just a slight tweak to how you approach it. Instead of saying like, oh, can I make a nature check? Just say like, is there any unusual plant life in the area that might indicate like some strange magical goings on or whatever?
That's one of those things that like Dave has said many times is like, don't ask to make the roll, ask for the information, and if the DM thinks you need a roll, then I'll say roll this.
That's actually what the guidance in the player's handbook says too. If you look
Well,
under like role playing, it's like it is literally says like don't ask to use the skill, just ask your questions in a way that makes it clear to the DM what you would like that to be.
But I think more people than not, it's just like, oh, can I insight this? Can I
right.
And I don't have a problem when players do that. I in fact have adjusted my thing where like I try to discourage a certain amount of role playing. So like I say like, oh well, is anyone proficient in this? And I deliver information.
Right. Yeah, that's a good
those players.
It's funny you mentioned that insights doesn't have anything to do with plants, but I was watching some other YouTuber video recently, and they're saying like, a player asked them, they're like, well, yeah, like I don't know if I trust this guy, and this and that, and it's like, can I make an insight check to see if I trust them? And the DM's like, well, you're telling me you don't trust them, so just don't trust them. It's like you had some like mechanical confirmation, like, yes, it is okay not to trust this person. It's like, just play that. Like, you don't trust them, then don't trust them.
Right. Yeah, and that's always fun. What you're saying, and using your specific example, the character that I play on Thursdays has insight. So like, even though he's a barbarian, like when we're not in a fight, he's aware of what's going on with the other person that he's talking to. So he's not like his cousin who's, what's going on over here? What's going on? Mm-hmm. He's more involved in the conversation. And even though, neither of the barbarians are very intelligent, he's attuned to talking to people.
Yeah.
Because like he spent time, working for the priesthood. That's just how it works. So you get into it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I love when you can find the inspiration for role playing from the mechanics on your sheet. That's sort of like the sweet spot for me.
Yep, and when you have a thing that kind of goes against your character, or like your typical archetype, the barbarian who insight or persuasion or what have you, you have something that's vastly different. Like the barbarian that Doug will be playing tomorrow night is the most intelligent person in the party. So like that's something that I absolutely adore about his character, and therefore
boy, I am so excited for that game.
I love the group that we've put together, and those bastards is just a fabulous game.
Yeah. If we're getting towards the end here. So yeah, if anybody's interested, we actually just dropped a trailer for that new season 2 of Those Bastards on this channel. If you want to go check it out, it's made by Stephen Partridge, our beloved friend and fellow gamer and Nerdarchy contributor. So yeah, I would urge you to check that out, and then come back tomorrow at 8:30.
So 23 hours and 30 minutes, or 23 hours and
minutes. We'll pick up with our party of half siblings. See what DM Robin has in store for us.
We all share the same dad, so therefore we're all, as Doug says, all half siblings, and it is an absolute hoot. We're going to be level 7 now, so that means 4th level spells for me.
Oh yeah, I think I just got like, what is a barbarian, like instinctive pounce or something? Like, it wasn't really all that interesting.
I got access. Speaking of plants, I got access to the blight spell.
Oh, nice.
So. As a shadow sorcerer, I'm like, yeah, that's dark and creepy enough for me.
Let's see. Oh yeah, I got feral instinct. It's funny, like the Unga is such like an ass kicker in combat that like I just focused on being more of a tank for Vent, because he just wants to protect his friends. So it's like, and me, it's like I love playing characters like I'll jump in front of the way and take the hit or whatever. That's fun for me. So
all right, well, we are past the 9 o'clock hour. I will get that list that I forgot, put together, and email the appropriate people, and then provide the list to our lovely friends here, so that they can be able to mention it next week and be able to move on from there, because I'll be on a plane flying to England when these guys will be streaming. So without further ado, thanks for hanging out with us, and until next time, stay nerdy.